Before there was a Dominican Republic, before there was a Haiti, there was simply an island, one of the first in the Caribbean to feel the boots of European conquest. An island the Taíno called Haiti, land of high mountains. The Spanish renamed it Hispaniola, and it became ground zero for a brutal colonial experiment: gold, slaves, and blood. It was here, among mountains and valleys now soaked with memory, that one man rose to challenge the empire. His name was Enriquillo, a Taíno cacique who would do the unthinkable, not just rebel but survive, not just fight, but win. To understand Enriquillo, you have to understand what was lost. The Taíno people were the first indigenous group to encounter Columbus in 1492. They were peaceful agriculturalists, worshippers of nature spirits called zemis, skilled at fishing, farming, and navigating the Caribbean by canoe. But their kindness was mistaken for weakness. Within a generation, the Spanish had enslaved them, forced them into brutal labor, and massacred tens of thousands. Entire villages were wiped out, women were raped, children taken. Resistance was met with steel and fire. By the early 1500s, the Taíno population had plummeted, from millions to tens of thousands in a matter of decades. But Enriquillo was different. He wasn't born in the forests. He was raised in the shadow of Spanish cruelty. A noble by blood, he was part of the high-ranking Ni Taíno class, a prince among his people. After the death of his father, he was taken in by Spanish friars and educated in a monastery. He could read, write, speak fluent Spanish. He was baptized and given the Christian name Enrique. But under the surface, the fire of his ancestors still burned. And as he grew, he began to see what his education could not hide: the hypocrisy, the brutality, the theft of his people's land and dignity. The Spanish thought they had tamed him, turned him into a model Christian, a success story of their so-called civilizing mission. But what they didn't realize is that Enriquillo was watching, learning, memorizing the way power worked in this new world. He studied not just the Bible, but the law. Not just Spanish customs, but their military formations, their communication networks, their weaknesses. By his early 20s, Enriquillo was living under the encomienda system, a cruel system of forced labor that essentially legalized indigenous slavery. Spanish colonists known as encomenderos were granted control over entire villages of Taíno people, extracting tribute and labor in exchange for so-called protection. Enriquillo, despite his status and education, was assigned to one such colonist. And it was here that the spark of rebellion was lit. One day, his wife, Doña Mencía, a fellow Taíno noble, was assaulted by a Spanish settler. Enriquillo sought justice through the colonial courts, believing his literacy and legal understanding would protect him. But the system was rigged. His pleas were ignored. His identity as a Christian and a noble meant nothing. The message was clear: he was property. His people were animals, and the law existed only to protect the conquerors. That was the last time Enriquillo asked for justice. From that day forward, he committed himself to rebellion. He disappeared into the wild and mountainous region of Bajoruco in the southwest of Hispaniola. This terrain, dense, steep, and largely inaccessible, became his sanctuary. It also became the staging ground for a war the Spanish never expected to last so long. What began as a small band of runaways quickly became a full-blown resistance movement. Former slaves, survivors of massacres, disillusioned Christianized Taínos, all of them joined Enriquillo, and he organized them with precision. Unlike the scattered uprisings of the past, Enriquillo's revolt was coordinated, strategic, and relentless. He trained his fighters in the art of guerrilla warfare. He knew how to ambush supply lines, how to vanish into the trees, how to attack at night and melt away by dawn. The Spanish had better weapons, but Enriquillo had the land. He used rivers, caves, and mountain passes as his allies. His warriors struck where the Spanish were weakest, avoiding direct confrontation and targeting their infrastructure. For 13 years, Enriquillo and his rebels waged war. The Spanish, confident in their superiority, expected the revolt to be crushed within months. But they were wrong. Time and again, their expeditions failed. Soldiers were killed, forts were burned. Morale began to sink. The colonial government sent more troops, then more. But every campaign ended the same way, in frustration. They tried to negotiate, but Enriquillo demanded freedom, not favors. They tried to divide his followers, offering bribes and titles, but he refused to sell them out. They even tried religious persuasion, sending priests to shame him into surrender. But Enriquillo, raised in a monastery, knew the scriptures better than most of them. His war wasn't driven by bloodlust. It was driven by principle. Enriquillo didn't want to exterminate the Spanish. He wanted to be left alone, to farm, to raise a family, to worship his gods and speak his language without fear of a whip or a collar. He fought for autonomy, and in the process he redefined what resistance could look like. Eventually, even the Spanish crown could no longer ignore him. Word of the rebellion had reached Spain. It was embarrassing. A small indigenous force defying an entire colonial regime. It made the empire look weak. In 1533, the authorities finally caved. They offered Enriquillo a formal peace treaty. Not an ultimatum, a negotiation. The treaty granted Enriquillo and his people freedom from tribute, recognition of their right to their ancestral lands, and a promise of non-interference from Spanish settlers. In other words, it was a diplomatic recognition of indigenous sovereignty, unheard of in the colonial world. And Enriquillo accepted, because he hadn't fought to die. He had fought to live. He spent the final years of his life in relative peace, still a leader among his people. He died around 1536, but his legacy was just beginning. For generations, his name was spoken in reverence. For the Taíno people, he became a symbol of pride, of strength, of possibility. And for the Spanish, he was a reminder that no empire is ever invincible. His story echoes through the hills of Hispaniola even today. His name lives on in the Dominican Republic. There are streets, towns, schools, and monuments dedicated to him. But more importantly, there is a spirit of resistance, of dignity, of cultural memory. In a world that so often writes indigenous peoples out of the history books, Enriquillo refuses to be forgotten. He wasn't the only one to resist colonization, but he was one of the few who survived it on his own terms, who forced the empire to sit down at the table and listen, who turned their laws, their language, and their arrogance against them. Enriquillo was both student and warrior, diplomat and outlaw, Christian and Taíno. He lived at the crossroads of cultures, and he used that position not to assimilate but to protect, to preserve what could still be saved. His rebellion wasn't just about land or law, it was about identity, about refusing to let an entire people be erased. In the grand theater of colonial conquest, he flipped the script. He proved that resistance could be strategic, that diplomacy could be a weapon, that even a small mountain nation could defy a global empire and win. So remember his name, Enriquillo, the prince who became a rebel, the rebel who became a legend, the legend who stood not just for vengeance but for vision. A vision of a future where his people could still speak their language, plant their crops, raise their children, and be free. Follow for more history they never taught us in school.